welcome everyone to our diversity and housing presentation. This presentation is coming from our Student Rights Advisory Committee here at Laurier. This committee focuses on delivering resources and information to students when it comes to their residential tenancy and academic rights. So my name is Nadine and I'm the coordinator of this committee. I worked alongside Emily to create this workshop. Emily she was our executive last year for this committee, and she came into her role with a real passion for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and really wanted to uncover some of the underlying issues that we don't necessarily talk about all the time, and that can get kind of swept under the rug within our department. So we decided that we would reach out and try to gain some new knowledge by speaking with different panelists, researchers, and more. So that's what brought us here today.
Thank you, Nadine. I'm just going to go ahead and give a brief land acknowledgement. We wanted to go ahead and not just take a moment to recognize the traditional land on which we reside, but also some ways that we can further educate ourselves on allyship and Indigenous resilience. So we're all coming from different places, obviously in a virtual world, but as many of you may know, or maybe you don't know, Wilfrid Laurier University's campuses are located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The Haldimand Treaty of 1784 that covers this area promised 6 nations 6 miles of land on each side of the Grand River, but these nations now unfortunately only reside on 5% of this original land. And the topic today that we're talking about in terms of housing instability cannot be looked at this adequately without thinking about the ways that specific barriers Indigenous peoples face in relation to place, shelter, and security on these lands. And the displacement of Indigenous peoples from traditional lands continues today and is an important consideration when advocating for accessible, affordable, and safe housing in places that also offer stability and continue to foster community ties. So we encourage participants to apply an intersectional lens to today's session to ensure that we keep these considerations in mind. And as well, if you'd like to learn more about the history of Six Nations and the role of women in defending these lands, we're going to put in the chat a great resource called 6 Miles Deep that gives a background of this in a documentary. As well, if you yourself are Indigenous and would like to connect with Indigenous peers, staff, and community events at Laurier, or if you're an ally hoping to get involved, please check out the Indigenous Student Center Instagram page, which I'll also put in the chat. So thank you for keeping these things in mind throughout the presentation, and I'll pass it off to Emily.
Hello everyone, my name is Emily, and like Nadine mentioned, I worked with her on SRAG, the Student Rights Advisory Committee last year. All throughout the year, I was the executive member, and I just worked alongside her to work with students as well, any problems or concerns they had, and tenancy issues, looking over leases, stuff like that. We worked together to solve those problems. I graduated from Laurier in the spring with a double major in law and society and human rights, and I'm really happy to be back here and to be part of this event that we spent quite a bit of time planning, and I'm glad we are here today to see it come to life. And I was really excited to watch this whole event grow and come to fruition, all these meetings, and obviously the support of all of our panelists and everyone that was willing to work with us. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm hoping everyone learns something from this panel, as there's a lot of important topics and important matters that we are going to be discussing. And I think it's crucial to sort of discuss these things as part of the SRAG committee and extend that to the Laurier community. Nadine, did you want to add anything else?
No, I think we can move on to the next slide and get to know our panelists.
Perfect. So welcome everyone. We're going to start off with Professor Eric Wiseman. So Dr. Eric Wiseman is a professor and a researcher at the University of New Brunswick in St. John. He studies topics such as homelessness, housing precarity, and addiction, some of which he has a lived experience with as well. He is best known for ethnographic research, writing and making films about lived experiences of social problems like homelessness. He also leads a national collaborative research group looking at post-secondary student homelessness and is well known for his research on tiny home communities in Canada and the US.
You make me sound very fancy. So I think I'm going to thank you for the introduction. Thanks for doing this. I realize that we had it planned a long time ago, and then COVID interrupted everybody's lives, but we're here now, and we have some good, I looked at who's here, and there's some good people with some really good information. So this could end up being a really cool conversation, I think. So I'm going to keep my slides to a minimum, but I need to get access. Do I have access to the screen?
Yeah, I'll just stop sharing and then.
Okay, there we go. So what do I do now? What do I do to share? Just share screen again. Or do I need?
So if you
There
can
it is.
use
Yeah, there it
slides.
is. Okay, and hopefully my dog won't. So are you guys seeing this now?
Yeah.
I'm going to keep it in this view because I like to see what's coming ahead, and I'm not going to go through every slide because there's 36 of them, and it was from a. But I have given the slide. I have access to the slides and a PDF. If you're interested and you want them, you can take them and use them, especially if you're talking to other students or administrations. This is basically the presentation we did at Student Dwell in Toronto a couple of years ago. And then COVID hit, so we didn't really do a whole lot of new research, except we designed the current research, which I'll talk about at the end. So let me just explain a little bit about what we're studying in this kind of this larger research collaboration. And Jane knows a lot about it because we've talked about it. And Jane and I are members of an organization called Making the Shift. LiveX, is that how I pronounce it? Because I heard Stephen Gates say LiveX, and I realized I've been calling it LiveX, and that's wrong. It sounds like an entertainment thing. And so there's a lot of really bright students there that you should all get to know in some way, who have lived experience of different issues facing youth, and I'm really happy to know them. And one of the things that we all know from different perspectives and from even from being in school at different times is that student housing precarity is not uncommon, and it's completely common actually. And the problem is that for the longest time, especially when I was growing up, and I hate to say this because it proves how old I am, but I'm almost 61. So when I was your age, it was a long time ago. When I started university in 1979, 1980, and sleeping in someone's basement, or not having my own apartment, or having to reside in other people's places, and students living in crappy little apartments in downtown Toronto, people accepted that as part of the narrative on student housing. That's just was part of the journey. In fact, a lot of the writers in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of the films that we watched, which was, let's not underestimate that for them for creating narrative. They sort of reinforced the coolness of living rough as a student, right? And so that really kind of lingered for like 35 years or so. And when I was able to go back to school and finish, I bottomed out on drugs and alcohol in the 1990s, and I left my PhD. And when I went back to school, in 2009, did my PhD again, I found that it was still an issue. Only now it was everywhere, and now student homelessness was the norm. In fact, people who were living in nice apartments came from more privileged places, and then I got jobs doing teaching assistantships and contract work and postdocs after my PhD, and I ended up in different cities. So I ended up in Galveston, Texas, and Portland, Oregon, and then Prince George and Red Deer, Alberta, and everywhere that I taught, including Montreal, where I was teaching. Students would knock on my door because of my lived experience, and they would say, "Dr. Wiseman, do you think we could talk about something?" And I would say, "Okay," and we'd sit down, and they didn't know who to talk to, but they would talk to me because they knew I'd been homeless. They say, "I'm homeless, and I don't know what I'm going to do about my school." And I didn't know what to do for them. So I would talk to other teachers and other administrators, and I wouldn't mention the student's name or anything, but I would say, "Look, we have a real problem here." And this happened at every school that I went to. And I'm going to tell you, the only time in my life that I have had a 100% statistical result was talking to the staff and faculty at these different colleges and universities where I worked. 100% of them had students facing the same issues. And they had these issues for the 20 years of their career. So this was not a new thing. but this is my secretary carbon. I don't know what that was. I'm sorry, he makes me laugh. So there's a great deal of narrative support from students wherever you go in post-secondary. And so remember, I was working at colleges and universities. So it seemed like across the board, it was transnational, interprovincial, housing issues for students were completely common, but couldn't find any information. And one of the reasons was it was difficult for people to study this as a thing. They didn't see student homelessness as separate from general experiences of homelessness. There was one article done by Kovacs Burns and company at the University of Alberta, and she's a really interesting researcher as well. I contacted her and shared some of her numbers. Their study that they did in 2014 and 15 was really brilliant. It showed that this kind of experience was affecting international students really badly, Indigenous students really badly, and that the numbers across the board were somewhere around 4%, meaning that based on the Canadian Observatory of Homelessness definition of homelessness, which has four types of experiences, within the range of literally being homeless to couch surfing, about 4 to 4.5% of Canadian students across all of post-secondary, were experiencing homelessness when they were surveyed. So there's 2,144,000 students at the time in post-secondary, and 83% of them are youth, 17 to 25 years old. So approximately 70,000 youth are experiencing homelessness today as a result of a number of different factors. We wanted to know what those were. So I was at Red Deer College at the time. I looked at the American literature, and this was really astonishing. In the United States, the numbers are approximately 10 to 20 times higher. So in the United States, you have 55 million post-secondary students. You have 23 million post-secondary students. And in some states, the number of students experiencing homelessness is as high as 18%. In fact, the national average is 18% based on our definitions, which means in the United States today, if you go to the Schoolhouse Connection, about 3.5 million full-time students are living in some form of homelessness. Now, literal homelessness is the lowest amount, so it's the least common. And you know what, you guys are going to hate me. He's whining at the door. I have to let him out. I'm sorry. That's what this is about. Okay, buddy, hold on. Don't be on the floor. Pretty weird when you're doing this stuff from home, and I apologize. So the point I'm making is that it's an astronomical problem that nobody really talks about, nobody wants to deal with. And again, this was almost 10 years ago. Now we're dealing with it because everywhere we went, we realized that this was a common story. And once we applied, the amazing thing was once we applied the definition, this 4-tiered definition, which ranges from couch surfing to being literally homeless, students would start saying, oh my God, I've been homeless, or lots of people I know have been homeless. So we did a survey at Red Deer, and the survey looked at basically trying to figure out how many students in Canada actually were homeless and what kinds of homelessness was most common. So I'm going to quickly go through some of our findings. So let me just skip ahead. One of the first things we needed to understand was the prevalence. So at that time, these are the numbers, they're in the that I just mentioned to you. At the time in Canada, there were 2,035,000 students. Now there are more, which means that the housing precarity and housing access is actually decreased. Also, we want to prevent students from entering these experiences, but what we realized when we started talking to students in these different locations was that 39% of them or more had experienced poverty or homelessness in K to 12 as well. So that there's an interconnection between earlier experiences of youth homelessness and later. And the science around homelessness tends to prove that earlier experiences tend to relate to ancillary and later experiences, adult experiences of homelessness. And there's a strange psychology to that, but it's something that we can talk about if it comes up in the questions. Canada, depending on whose definition you use, defines youth as 15 to as old as 34. It depends on if it's the Department of Labor or Stats Canada. I'm looking at youth essentially from 17 to 25, which is consistent with making the shift in Away Home Canada, who are major contributors to the work that we do in youth prevention these days. So we realize that post-secondary student homelessness affects older people too. Don't forget that 20% of people in post-secondary are adults, people going back to reinvent themselves, who are trying to escape poverty or make themselves more relevant. And many of them they have families, they've left the job market to go to school, and they're living in precarious housing. But the research that we're doing currently doesn't really focus on them, although it does focus on their experiences of homelessness as youth, because most of them are willing to go to this length because they've experienced it before. They know how to navigate it. And so that made us really interested in understanding what resilience looks like. So basically the goals of the study are to understand, to create a survey tool, which we did. And Andre Ann, who's in the audience, and her organization Untitled, who are an amazing organization, took some of our questions, and they've now done a very large survey. But we were at the time had no information to deal with, and so we did a bunch of online surveys with different universities. We did it with Red Deer College, we did it with Lakehead, we did it with the University of Calgary and UMB. And we found that across the board, when we did this online survey, the numbers were almost, again, kind of supportive and identical. We really wanted to understand, and we still want to understand, is what can we tell institutions to help them support students who are facing homelessness or housing precarity? Because one of the things that our case study showed us was that, I mean, I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but the distribution is pretty obvious. There's a very gendered component to the responses that we got, because we were surveying within the social sciences. Almost between 70 and 80% of the responses were from people who identified as female, and the least percentage was amongst LGBTQ and people who declare themselves as other. And again, 80% were 18 to 25 years old. So almost the demographics at every university were almost exactly the same. However, the responses people had to being homeless might have been different. And that had a lot to do with where they were, the kind of services that the universities offered or didn't offer. And so here's some of the thematic findings that we came up with. Now, I'm rushing through this, but if you read through the PowerPoints, you'll see there's some really cool data in there. So prior experience with homelessness, between 23 to 32%, the average was around 28%. So it's a pretty significant number when you realize that, and we're talking about literal homelessness in this case. So people who are unsheltered, hidden, or provisionally housed, as high as 10% literal homelessness amongst these groups. So that's about 3 times higher than the Canadian average for unsheltered homelessness. So there's something, people are ending up back in school, but they're used to experiencing homelessness to such a degree that they're willing to sleep rough. But they're also, that's a problem for them, but they're also willing to sleep in someone's basement because that doesn't feel like homelessness to them. And that's what they said when we would talk to them. That's not homelessness to me. I've been homeless. Okay, so the other thing that I think is really important is that the worrying about becoming homeless is a stress that students can't deal with. But the most important thing, and this is what Dr. Wagemaker Schiff pointed out from Calgary, these surveys were being done in real time. So even of the 700 responses or so that we got, every single one of those persons who said, yes, they've been homeless or they are homeless was in school at the time. So the theme that we started to focus on was resilience. They're resilient. They're staying in school despite living in terrible housing conditions. So one of the things that they had to do to navigate this experience was not let their friends know, because there's an intense stigma attached with being homeless. So that was one of we asked, what kind of tactics do you use to navigate your homelessness? And they said, well, we don't tell anyone. And if we were going to tell someone, we might tell a teacher if we thought if we wouldn't get jeopardized for it. But one of the main reasons students didn't tell anyone is they were afraid that the schools, the institutions, would prevent them from advancing in their courses, in their programs, because being homeless is seen as undermining their academic experience. Would you leave school and get a job before going homeless? Well, almost in all cases, at least a third to 40% said, yeah, they would definitely do that. And when we see most likely, we associate that with a yes. So about 60 to 70% of respondents would probably leave school and get a job before going homeless. So this is really important for us. This is something we want to prevent. This country needs students to have jobs. It needs skills and training. And don't forget, colleges aren't just teaching the arts. We're talking art at Red Deer College. It's a polytechnic institute, and people are leaving school to go work because they can't afford it and because they don't have housing. And we're going to have a very serious labor shortage of skilled labor in the future. We're already facing that issue in Canada now. They won't talk to anyone. They'll talk to a priest, perhaps. They may talk to the student counselors, but only within a culture of care and trust. And so these are things that are important to us. As a result of this, we've been talking to universities about how to create a trusting space where students are anonymous, or at least where they're treated confidentially and safe to go talk about their housing precarity. And then I'm skipping through a lot of the themes, but the big one for us was stigma. And that's why we wrote this into the article in Parity magazine. The fact that students, this is just bizarre, in Alberta and out west, a lot of students didn't admit to being homeless because they didn't want to be associated with the image of what homelessness is. And some of this is racist and some of it is classist. They didn't want people to think of them as being bums. This is what they would say, quote unquote, bums sleeping on benches or Indians sleeping in laneways. That quote, I used it in my original report, and the person was being really honest, but that really struck home, because the truth is that student homelessness across Canada is disproportionately affecting individuals from low income and from our Indigenous, especially in Alberta and BC, and from Indigenous groups as well. So one of the things that we have to deal with is removing the stigma of being homeless, so people will reach out and talk about it, so that students will come together and kind of upstream ideas about how to overcome this. I had a hard time when I saw that comment. It was made a few times in our study, and being raised very differently than people are out there, I thought that, we really need to look at what limits help-seeking behavior. And so the University of Edmonton got involved with our project, and they said the same thing. They said they have an amazing project for students who are experiencing homelessness, but they said students won't come out and say they're homeless. They'll say they're not sleeping well. They'll say that they're having problems with food and nutrition. They'll talk about things that are associated with homelessness, but they won't say I'm homeless because of the stigma attached to it. So we have to find new language for students to approach the topic if we're going to try and prevent it. And if we're going to try to design solutions, the solutions may be about things related to housing, not just the housing itself. So what we're really interested in is the role of school. Now, students and pretty much the entire population realize that schools have a role to play. So currently, I guess I have a couple minutes left, do I? 2 minutes? Is that right? Somebody tell me, because I lose track.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I want to say that we currently after the study went out, a lot of people joined into the conversation, and the press picked it up, and at least 30 other universities and colleges got a hold of us, and we had all these great plans. Util and us were going to do this big study, and then COVID hit, so everything kind of got shelved. And now it's all starting up again. We finally have received some funding to do the kind of study that we want to do. And now that the quantitative measures are being done or have been done, there's a large survey was sent out, and a number of the questions that we asked were synthesized into their survey. So we'll have that information soon. I don't know the numbers yet. Now we're free to do the qualitative part. So we've designed a research program where students will be talking to other students about the experience of housing precarity, and they'll be talking to faculty, and then they'll be bringing students and faculty together to design solutions for each institution that's part of the project. So it's an amazing project funded by Making the Shift, and I'm very excited about it, but it will really allow us, it's very pragmatic. All the work that I do is really pragmatic. I don't need to reinvent the theory, but I do want us to invent the solutions. And that's kind of where we're working, because we believe that education is a basic right. And we all know that in Canada, there's a law, I think it's Bill C-97, that says that housing is a basic right. So I think we need to work towards those things. And I think if we're not helping our students either avoid homelessness or helping them navigate out of it, then we're going to force students to endure the kinds of responses. And I'll close with the kinds of responses that scare me. On the survey, a number of students said that they would stay in abusive relationships, and they do, and they still do. I have students in my classes today who stay in not just abusive, but dangerous relationships. So we look at suicide and mental health issues, and especially in the Maritimes, and a lot of it is related to housing situations, and people sense that they can't leave and they're not free to leave. So they'll leave school to move to somewhere else so they don't have to stay in those relationships. Some will join and get involved in the sex trade. And regardless of how one feels morally about the sex trade, that's not a choice you want to make if you're going into school. I mean, you shouldn't have to make that choice, just like you shouldn't have to make a choice to work 4 jobs at McDonald's to go to school, if you know what I mean. And also the students were getting involved in drug dealing, and they were getting involved in subcultures that allowed them to overnight, which, by the way, is how I navigated my homelessness. So I became a creature of the night, and that's why I ended up losing my ability to go to school. I had to stay up all night because I had nowhere to sleep. So the choices that some students make to stay in school proves one thing: they want to stay in school. It's important to them, and we owe them to find the solutions to do that. There you go. That's my share for tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wiseman. So we're going to ask everyone at this point to hold any questions that you may have. We'll have a Q&A period after our next presenter. Thank you so much, Dr. Wiseman. And if Emily would like to introduce our next presenter.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Wiseman, for that insightful presentation. And now we will move on to our next panelist, Professor Jane Malenfant. So Jane Malenfant is from Kapuskasing, Ontario, and currently works as an assistant professor in the Department of Education at Concordia University. And they are co-founder of the Making the Shift Scholars with Lived Experience Network, and their research focuses on schools, homelessness prevention, and community-led housing justice. Go ahead, Jane, whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much. Can folks see my screen and hear me?
Yeah, you have
Okay,
really nice
great.
slides.
Oh yeah, I stole them from a colleague, which is usually the best way to go. Eric, I echo a lot of what you were saying, and I was excited to hear about this research again because I think it's so relevant. I'm going to share less of my findings from a research perspective and more about kind of the context within which my research operates, who I do research with, and then what some of these solutions we are looking at is, and particularly looking at the context within a Canadian settler state and how housing precarity is experienced in diverse ways. Unfortunately, up till the last minute, I was really hoping my co-researcher Cheyenne Narcisse would be able to join me and we could talk about our work together. But unfortunately, that didn't work out. But I'm one member of a 6-member team of Youth Action Research Revolution, which is a participatory research project that we've been working on here in Tiohtià:ke or Montreal. And so this is in partnership with an organization, Dans la Rue. There's a little photo of Dans la Rue's day center down there. And we've been doing this work since 2018. Of the 6 members of the research team, 5 of us have lived experience of homelessness. And then there's also Dr. Naomi Nichols, who was my doctoral supervisor. And we also have intersecting experiences of institutional discrimination. And so this is how we've begun to think about housing precarity, and especially schools, which is where I think of housing precarity and thinking of those intersections. So I'll be sharing some of our work and how we've been thinking about kind of systemic creations of homelessness. So I wanted to contextualize how homelessness has kind of come to be and look at how this is a policy issue. Not only a policy issue, and there's a lot of things, including stigma, like Eric was talking about, but the way that we see homelessness now is shaped by policy and practice. So we can look at defunding of housing programs, part of like broader neoliberal measures. We can look at, Thatcher, Reagan, Mulrooney. We can look at Harris in the 90s and see how this has shaped how people are precariously housed in diverse ways today. We can look at the cancellation of the national housing policy in 1993. There is a national housing policy again, but for a very long period there wasn't. We can also look to increase criminalization of visible homelessness. So this also leading to some of the stigma that Dr. Wiseman was talking about. We can look at the Safe Streets Act in Ontario and how that has functioned to criminalize people who are on the streets, who are panhandling, who are just visibly without a home. And then we can also see the ways that the nation state has downloaded kind of responsibility to communities and nonprofits to kind of take care of people who are experiencing precarity without the social safety net. And so students are also part of populations impacted by this. And then we can also look at kind of racist and discriminatory policies as part of the broader shaping of homelessness and housing precarity in Canada, as well as issues and barriers to accessing education. So in preparing for this, we were talking a lot about redlining as something that people talk about that they often don't know about. Redlining in Canada, so redlining being the practice of picking particular neighborhoods where you will limit access to financial resources like bank loans and other ways of establishing kind of intergenerational wealth. Redlining is really not often talked about in a Canadian context. And part of that is because Canada is really terrible at keeping data on race and race and difference. And so this is something that, you know, the Toronto police have been critiqued for. It's by and large a way of erasing difference and maintaining this idea that Canada is not the States, and Canada's approach to, you know, having racist policies and practices is not the same, when in reality, we know that that's not really true. So we can also look to neglect of infrastructure in particular communities and how that leads to a lack of access to education. So Eric, when you're talking about how people experiencing homelessness in kind of K to 12 are less likely to have stability when they go to post-secondary, they're less likely to go to post-secondary. They're more likely to experience cycles of poverty and homelessness. And this isn't by accident. This is, you know, it's far less likely that you're going to be able to access education in those ways if you're born into these kind of intergenerational cycles of poverty. We can look at examples like Africville that a lot of Canadians might be familiar with, which is a Black neighborhood in Halifax, which was not only denied, you know, financial resources, but was actually physically demolished. We can think of the pass system in terms of Indigenous peoples and how movement, particularly in Western provinces, was limited. So you had to have a pass and you could not move between reserves. You could not go to the city. And this was really meant to limit people's movement on land and where people could be. And then we can think, of course, about reserves and how reserves are crown land. And what does that mean for property and housing, if we're thinking of home ownership in particular, but also just in terms of stability and housing, stability and safe, stable housing. And then we can also look to more insidious policies. And a lot of young people we're talking about in post-secondary, we're talking about rental discrimination. In Quebec, there is a pretty strong rent tenants board, but the problem is that you can't access it. The onus is on people renting to try to access it and take their landlords to court or take their prospective landlords to court if they're facing rental discrimination. And young people we talk to really emphasize that this is really xenophobic. And so ways to stop newcomers from accessing rental units. And so we can see that it's not by accident that particular populations are overrepresented in the homeless population and underserved in the services that exist. And then the final kind of context piece that I wanted to talk about is the financialization of housing and education. So seeing housing as a commodity, seeing school as a commodity. So no longer is, you know, a condo, maybe a theoretical home across cities in Canada and elsewhere. We have condos that are sitting empty while people are experiencing homelessness because they're seen as kind of accruing capital rather than being a place where someone might live. So also, as Dr. Wiseman noted, lack of affordable housing. We see this kind of compounding with time, increased cost of living where students just can't pay tuition, can't pay rent. People in general can't. That the cost of rent is so much more than, you know, social assistance would allow for, and you have to be working multiple jobs. And then also the increased credentialization and barriers to accessing the labor market after school, which Dr. Wiseman was also talking about. So you need to go to school for longer to get an entry level position. And so a lot of people, particularly again, people whose families have not had access to those spaces historically and continue to face discriminatory policies, can't access those. So the divide becomes bigger and bigger. And so the question that we ask as a research team is how can we shift how housing access, that's a confusing sentence, but how can we shift how access to housing and education is structured in Canada? And so one of the things that we as a team like to do is education on housing precarity, and exactly what you were saying, Eric, people, both students and teachers in post-secondary share that I didn't know that post-secondary students could be homeless. The amount of times we've gone in as a team to talk to folks and they say, what you're talking about, you experience sounds a lot like what I'm going through right now. And so then we're trying to mobilize supports to ensure they have a place to stay, but also it's very evident that this is something that happens again and again. And so what we champion is valuing people's lived experiences and supporting those who are most impacted by these policies and practices and lack of access to lead the way in changing how we respond to things, and really focusing on housing justice. What does it look like to think of this from a justice perspective? And then the other thing that we kept hearing while we were talking to students is that despite the rise in equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives in post-secondary, those are often not led by those who are most impacted, and instead become these kinds of performative exercises where they're talking about equity, but in reality, there's still huge barriers for people to even get their foot in the door. And when they are, they're not supported, they don't have peers, and they're facing these kinds of dilemmas that Dr. Wiseman was talking about of, having to work a billion jobs to do continue school. They're not able to participate and have access to learning in the same ways. Yeah, and so those were kinds of the context within which our team is working and how we're thinking about all of these issues. And I am really interested, I know there's some folks in the room who have thoughts on this as well, to have a Q&A, and I'm happy to talk more about our findings, but also about our process and our team. And yeah, that's it from me.
I think that was great. I love pretty much everything you do is collaborative, which I love. And it's actually collaborative. You just don't use, it's like saying equity, diversity, and inclusion, but not actually doing it. You actually, when you say those things, you mean them. So if any of you ever want to rack someone's brain. Also, I just got a message from Andréanne, who is working with us. She's our partner from UTIL, and one of the numbers that they got back from their 18,000 responses was the prevalence number, which was 5%. So, which is very close to the number that we were getting. So I now feel really confident. Like if I went on the news tomorrow, I'd be confident saying 5% of Canadian students are experiencing some form of homelessness, which puts the number at close to 100,000, if you think about it. So is that right? 5% of 2 million? No.
And that's such an interesting number to hear as a student who's thinking of, the 26 people on my residence floor. It's like one of those people could be experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
Or like even just in your peer groups.
Well, also, one of the things that we're going to find in supporting some of the other research is that I want to say doctor, because you're like so close, Professor Malenfant. Can I just call you Jane? Because I just it's just I know anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, you're still behind the 8 ball if you're a person, if you're an immigrant or refugee, a person of color, especially an Indigenous person, if your gender isn't the right gender. These, it sounds like if you look at the rate of things, sociologists like me like looking at the rate, and we do see that things are changing, but the equality has not been achieved. So those barriers are still in place, obviously, since things haven't changed. So I think one of the things that we're going to find when we get the rest of these numbers is that some of the original relationships that we pointed to do contribute to that experience of student homelessness.
Perfect. Well, I think this is a pretty natural point to open things up to our Q&A period.
Well, sorry, I thought I was doing that.
I just want to make sure that any participants in the room feel comfortable. You can either unmute yourself or pop your question into the chat. And feel free to pick our panelists' brains.
I have a question for Professor Wiesman. So you brought up the concept of using like inclusive language to support the homeless people around us, and I was just wondering like what an example of that would be.
That's for me?
Yeah.
Well, I think that we need to, well, this is what they're doing actually at the Nova Scotia Community College, who also has a really cool housing program, and at the Safe, it's called the Safe House Project in Edmonton at the University of Alberta. They're not even using that word. I mean, the word is eliminated because first of all, if you're having housing difficulties or you're houseless, in fact, in the United States right now, where I did a lot of my research, almost all of my homeless activists, my once homeless activist friends, have started abandoning that word, and they're calling themselves the houseless community because they don't need home. They have actually homes, they have communities, they have friends, they have these networks. They need houses, they need structures. So changing the language so that it's not as marginalizing, because we can't get over the first homeless laws really in the West came out in the 1400s, and they're the same Tudor and Elizabethan poor laws that came to North America in 1601 when the colonialists got here, and they still haven't changed, right? So we can't get around, we can't say somebody's homeless or a vagabond or something like that without implying that negative stereotype unless we get rid of that language altogether. So I think inclusive language isn't about extending to reaching out to people to let them know that there's a safe place for them. I mean, we need to create cultures of care in our institutions where students know it's safe to go. But I think if we stop using words that are stigmatizing, like homelessness itself, I think that's a big step. And in fact, we don't really say don't say homeless people too much anymore. And Jane can, Dr. to be Malenfant can say this. We say people experiencing homelessness, people with lived experience of it, because otherwise we're defining them by that condition. And I think that's one of the ways to invite people into a conversation that might be of benefit to them. I wonder what Dr. or Professor Malenfant would say about that.
I think that's a tricky one because for me, my approach is that I ask people how they want to be identified. And so that means that sometimes we're using different terminology. And in our group, because there's 6 of us and we all have different experiences, we'll use different words. Words sometimes that we have to have a conversation about because they make people feel uncomfortable. One alternative critique that I've heard is, to say, I'm home free or I'm houseless, or these things that some people really levitate to, and I understand why, sometimes erase the reality of that. And so I've had young people say, I'm homeless. Like, I'm not going to say anything else because that's my reality. And so I think that it depends too on your context and what you're trying to do. But I do think that there's something about the word homeless that prevents people from accessing services. They don't want to identify as homeless for many people. And so I think that there's really something to creating services that speak to different experiences and address that stigma.
That's what Kevin Frise, who's part of our network, says at the University of Alberta. In fact, it's quoted in the Precarity article. Students were presenting to them with issues of, like I said, food shortages, difficulties with their landlords, a lot of stress due to what they refer to as difficult housing situations. But it would take several layers of conversation and maybe more than one visit to the accommodations and services folks before they would say, look, the bottom line is I'm homeless. People don't like saying that about themselves. And it's, in fact, some people will go through these incredibly awful experiences before not that they don't admit it to themselves, but before they'll admit it to someone else. And that's what we need to change. We need to make it possible for people to say, look, I need some help. It's normal and I need help. And that's really the truth. So.
Yeah, thank you for your guys' answers. That was really interesting insight. Thank you for that.
That leads into one of the questions I had for both of you. So how can we support friends who might be experiencing homelessness?
That's really interesting.
I would say also ask them. Yeah.
No, you go, Jane, because I'm going to find a statistic on that. I have actually a stat for that. Go.
I have no statistics, but I would say ask them. I think that this is part of the issue when we're trying to create blanket responses within, whether it's within universities or, you know, provincially or federally, is that people experience these things in such unique ways. And I think that's part of where the diversity piece comes in too. And so asking what people need. Do you need a couch to crash on? Do you need access to services? Do you know what exists in your city? So that's one my go-to is always, have you checked out this organization? They give out food, they give out harm reduction supplies, they have workshops, they can connect you with a mental health professional, which is huge for everyone. Everyone needs, you know, to access mental health supports when they need them, and can't always do that. So usually those are my two kinds of go-tos of asking, you know, what do you think you need right now? And have you been made aware of the supports that exist in the place that we're at? Because a lot of times what we've seen too is if people are moving for school, which often, especially people from the north, will have to move down south to go to a city, and then they don't know what exists there. They don't really have support systems. So just asking, you know, do you know what's out there and what do you think you need is a good start.
So when I said statistics, I didn't mean literally on that, but we did ask in the survey that we did, the 3 different versions that we did ask, who would you talk to? Because it seemed that they would, you know, teachers are very often on the front lines. And if you have a young, hip teacher, or a teacher has life history and they're not afraid to share it with their students, a lot of those teachers are approached. And when I was at Prince George, there were a lot of students who were afraid to come out because of it's a small community that was very, you know, I'm being kind when I say it's conventional. It's pretty harsh on people who aren't conventional. So I had a good colleague there who came out while he was teaching, and so a lot of students finally found someone that whose door they could knock on. And in my case, there were students who were facing different types of precarity, and so the two of us sort of our hallway sort of became like, I felt like we had this really great experience going on for the period of my contract, where the most important work we did was in our offices. However, it made me, I wanted to know who people talk to, and they said, we won't talk to anyone here. So when I got to Red Deer, I asked the same questions. And so at Red Deer, 31.5% of people said they would talk to a friend, 42% said they would talk to a relative, and then teachers and instructors were at 5%. And that's pretty much across the board in that order. The numbers aren't the same, but that's the order of things. And the worst thing is that only 3% of the students that were surveyed at the 3 different universities, between 3 and 1.4 to 3% of students would talk to the student accommodations people about being homeless. And I think so for me, with the work we're doing now, and I think I think Andre Ann's listening to this because she's one of the partners in our research. That's the target. That has to change, because they're actually there to help students. And so students don't think that there's any services. They think all they're going to do is stigmatize themselves and waste time. And so that's a structural piece that needs to be corrected from these simple few questions. We know that in all of these schools, no students are afraid to talk about their precarity to anyone who actually works for the institution. So changing that culture into a culture of caring, which is cultures of care have been around for a very long time. That's going to be a difficult thing to do, but I think universities and colleges, I think post-secondary is willing to do it now. So I just thought I would share that. That's in the slides. You can see the actual numbers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely did. Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions coming in from the crowd? We're getting close to our time.
I have a question as well for Dr. Wiseman.
Sure.
I was just wondering, what are some contributing factors that are unique to post-secondary student homelessness as opposed to other forms of homelessness?
That's a really good question, you know, and well, you see, we found a lot of unique experiences in older people experiencing post-secondary homelessness, because they had already entered and left school for the most part, or were leaving the workforce, had lost their jobs, and were already facing housing precarity when they went back to school, or they were going back to school to upgrade their jobs. And so there was a lot on the line. So if I want to talk about youth, and I'll say, again, my definition of youth ends at around 25. because I'm using the definition of a funder that I'm working with right now. I think it's important to include the experience of older students. And today in Canada, the number of students who are older and going back to school is increasing, especially with online schools, because now they can work, have families, and be back at school, which doesn't really affect the homelessness question, except they're losing jobs and the market is changing, and they're looking at education as an opportunity, not to just build skills and develop them as individuals, but they're actually looking at it with a very concrete goal. Like they want to get a trade degree, they want to get a terminal degree that'll help them get a pay raise at work. So that depends on what the student's purpose is, and that's very closely related to their age. And so most youth who are starting school for the first time, the first couple of years are always ambiguous and a little, your grades might not be great, and you're filling things out. But when you develop a track and you're serious and you're trying to get a certain degree or get to a certain place, then you need to have stable housing, because you can't achieve those goals. It's very competitive these days. If you're in a psychology program and you get under a 90, it's difficult to move ahead into the program you want to go to. If you're in medical school and in the sciences, especially, and engineering, very competitive. And we find a lot of international students are in those disciplines where getting very high grades is important for moving on. And so you find them sacrificing housing. You find, actually, when Kovacs Burns did her study, the way that they found out that the problem was so great amongst international students is that security guards are finding them sleeping in stairwells and gymnasiums and in chemistry labs. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. It's hard. It just seems so complex to me. The nuances that are associated with the different types of homeless experience. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that depending on who the student is, the experience of housing precarity in post-secondary is going to look very different. So it's difficult to understand what would lead to it, in other words. I think that we're really interested in early prevention these days. I think I have, in my mind, one of the goals for our study is to produce a tool for students who are coming, who voluntarily, who want to examine their precarities and understand. We have vulnerability assessment tools, and some people are very against them. And I did one when I went to rehab, and it was really useful for me to identify the things that could lead me into trouble coming out of this vulnerable place that I was in. So there are students who you may want. It's a very simple tool that helps people understand what their expenses are, what their housing is like, what their workloads are like, and where they're vulnerable or not vulnerable. And that might be something that can help students prevent students from getting into housing situations that might be troublesome. I think the biggest thing that we can do for students right now across the board is provide a no penalty opportunity for students to step back from their education without losing their traction, especially if they've entered housing precarity. If the costs are getting too high, if their relationships where they're living are troublesome, they shouldn't feel like they're forced to stay in those situations. And so a number of universities, like the one at Nova Scotia Community College, they've introduced housing for students to take a transitional time out. So it all depends on what the student's actually doing. I don't think there's a general thing that we can do for all students. And I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
You've got a question in the chat here.
Oh, it's Elaine.
So how can we deal with the trauma for homeless and precarious living students who sought help from their professors, departments, and universities and were shamed and punished?
Oh. Professor Malenfant, do you want to take that one?
Yeah,
I'll just get angry.
Thank you. I will also get angry. Thank you for the question, Elaine. I think this is really tricky. And I think it relates to the normative idea of who students are in post-secondary. So a lot of what we've been talking about is the idea that students are housed, but also that students are coming from wealthy enough families that they have supports, that they're coming from places where their parents might be able to help them navigate these university situations. And so, you go into these spaces and your supervisors, your professors, administrators, teachers often do not know what you're going through. And so I think one thing we can do is increase representation and diversity in departments. So being able to see people who look like you, who have similar experiences to you that you can go to and you know that they get it. But then also that is not happening fast enough. So Elaine, initiatives like the shoestring initiative that you've started in response to, you know, this absence of support for students who have experienced poverty and are organizations like the Scholars with Lived Experience Network. That's something that just doesn't naturally occur in university spaces because people don't want to talk about it, and because it's very rare often that people will get to post-secondary because of all the barriers just to get there. I got kicked out of high school. I ended up back in school, but it wasn't, you know, and I know, Eric, it was the same for you. This wasn't a normal trajectory to get into school. And I use normal in an ironic sense. But I will also say that there's not enough being done, and maybe education is a piece of that, educating teachers and post-secondary administrators and staff about what homelessness looks like and how it's actually impacting people, you know, studies like yours, Eric, because the amount of trauma I've seen and the amount of inappropriate things that have happened to students I know who have experienced homelessness, are experiencing homelessness, has been completely horrific. And they just perpetuate these ideas that, you know, I went to McGill for my PhD, that McGill is an elite institution where homelessness doesn't exist. And that's just not the case. So I think educating folks who are working in universities that this is something, but also creating really strong networks of solidarity across different people who are in these spaces, because we have to keep each other well in these toxic environments. So
Can
I know
add
you
to
do
that,
a lot
Kate?
of amazing work. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, so like that's the final product for this study that we're doing. It's not really a study, it's a project, is to create this national student-led collective, exactly what you just said, to build these a national safe space for students who experience precarity, to apply pressure on administrations and teachers who are idiots, frankly, excuse my language. But I mean, honestly, I also think that there's Elaine, I also think there's something interesting going on. The old guard of academia, the boomer guard, is retiring. And so you guys are going to be, I mean, I'm old, but I'm a new scholar. I mean, I'm a lot older than you guys chronologically, but I got my degree 10 years ago. So I'm a new scholar too. So that old guard is starting to leave and retire. And I think people who are more awake, you know, and more in tune with what's actually going on, what it actually means to be a student, you know, how hard it really is. It's not easy like it was when they made The Graduate, that film. There are some elite institutions, but you know, we're not worrying about the elites. They don't seem to have the same problems that we have. So I think that a conversation is going to change. I'll be honest with you. I've heard some professors say stupid things, and I'm privileged because I'm a prof, and I can say to them, you know, that's just uncool, that's uncaring. But I get angry when I see you asking that question, Elaine, not at you, but at the fact that a professor who's supposed to be a mentor and a teacher and is on the front lines of people's curiosity would react that way. I mean, shaming someone and punishing them for being in a tough spot is, I'll be glad to see them go when they go. Sorry, I get a little angry when I see that.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time.
Can I just add one thing? I'll tell you why.
Of course.
The reason that makes me angry is that when I was starting to bottom out and having some issues, and I had a professor who said, I have no reason to believe you'll accomplish anything you set out to do. When I decided to go back to school, he said, based on who you were before, I can't write you a letter. I have no reason to believe you'll accomplish anything you set out to do. So the only reason I'm a success today was to prove him wrong. But so Elaine, I know exactly what that feels like when you mention that. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you to both of our panelists today for sharing those inspiring words. And thank you so much for coming and joining us today. I know I sure learned a lot. I hope that everyone else here with me learned a lot as well.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for coming, Brittany. We're happy you made it out. So we just wanted to take a moment to promote some of our resources. So we are the Student Rights Advisory Committee. We have an Instagram page for both our Brantford and Waterloo teams. So please feel free to follow those pages, and we'll keep you up to date on any more workshops, any more education and resources that are coming out, as well as if you ever need support. It's a great place to know how to reach out.